Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, bright and early, to have this conversation that I think is really important. My name is Jillian White. I'm a senior associate editor at The Atlantic, cover issues of economics, fees and fines in prisons and jails, and reform in the criminal justice system. So before I introduce my wonderful panelists, I just want to give a little bit of scene setting for the conversation that we're about to have today. So I'm sure you guys all saw the top line of this is the toll of mental illness behind bars. But when you report on it, when you work in it, when you live in it, the statistics don't quite do it justice, but it'll kind of help frame our conversation. So at this point, prisons and jails are responsible for caring for 10 times the number of mentally ill patients as hospitals are. At any given point in their lives, 25 to 40% of mentally ill Americans will spend time in a prison or a jail. That means that prisons and jails have become our largest care provider for the mentally ill in this country. Given what we know about the challenges in the criminal justice system and what we know about the challenges of caring for the mentally ill and how we even perceive mental illness in this country, think about the intersection of that for a second and all of the issues that that brings up. So what we want to do in this panel today is not just talk about the problems here and the enormity of it, but what we want to talk about is how to address this at every single level before people come into interaction with the criminal justice system, when they are there, and what happens when they leave, how they're able to get care and not go back to this place that ostensibly has a very hard time treating them. So joining me today, we have Tom Dart. He's the sheriff of Cook County. And we have Glenn Martin, who is a formerly incarcerated reformer, who is the president of Just Leadership USA. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So the place I want to start is a question for both of you. So when you look at the Constitution says that jails and prisons, the criminal justice system, is required to provide adequate medical care, which includes mental care, to everyone who is under its care, everyone who is under their roof and being taken care of by them. Is that happening, and if not, why?
I'll jump in. So I'm glad you started with the Constitution because my context for this conversation and the thing that's most immediate for me is Rikers Island in New York City, a place where we have 10 jails on a very actually remote island, although it's only 200 feet away from LaGuardia Airport. It is a penal colony, a place where 80% of the people are detained and not convicted of a crime, 89% people of color in a city where people of color are 56%. We spend $247,000 per bed per year. And the reason I'm glad you started with the Constitution, because I would argue that many of the people that are there wouldn't be there if things like speedy trial, which is guaranteed to people in our Constitution, actually existed. But it seems like the Constitution dies at the bridge to Rikers Island. And going beyond that, it's a place where 41% of the people that are there have a mental health diagnosis, 12% serious and persistent mental illness. But again, a place where we're investing $240,000 per bed per year with some of the most abysmal outcomes. I can't think of any other industry that would have such a failure rate and not only continue to operate, but we'd continue to feed it resources. Our mayor, arguably a very progressive mayor, Mayor de Blasio, has invested an additional $500 million since he's been in office to try to address this issue of mental health. And I get a chance to tour the facility every once in a while. And what I've seen is the effort being made by the city to create environments where people with the most serious mental illness can receive treatment. But on an island where 65% of the infrastructure was supposed to be taken offline years ago, literally the physical infrastructure is falling apart. And so what you end up seeing is a very expensive version of lipstick on a pig, unfortunately. And it's the reason why we launched a campaign to actually shut down Rikers a little over a year ago, which I hope to talk about in a future question.
Well, Jillian, your point is right on, because no matter where you're from around the country here, this is a national disgrace, and people need to understand that. I mean, the criminal justice system doesn't even do the criminal part well. let alone all of a sudden inject people who are mentally ill into it. It was never designed for that. But much like people now have a tendency to sort of gloss over, how posterity is going to view us, we will be held by everybody 100 years from now as these awful, awful people. And I dare say, if you think about the 1850s in Britain, I guarantee you most of the people at that point in time thought they were doing pretty well by folks. But yet when you think of that period of time, you think of Dickens and you think about the horrible things they did to people there. We're doing the exact same thing right now. We absolutely are. And I'm the sheriff of the second largest jail in the United States. And I can tell you firsthand that all throughout the United States, this is going on. The mentally ill are being dumped into prisons and jails because of indifference. Not because they're bad people, not because they're criminals, because we as a society don't care. We don't care. And I really, really get tired when people start talking to me about all these different points in the issue about trying to justify what we're doing here. There is no justification for what we're doing. None. These are people with an illness. And if that's the case, let's start picking on the diabetics. Let's start rounding them up and throwing them in jails as well, because they deserve it as well as the mentally ill do, I guess, because that's what we do here. So in Chicago, we do things a little bit differently, or some people suggest a lot differently when it comes to the mentally ill. We treat them like patients from the time they come in to the time they leave. But if you go around the country, I can't speak as well as Glenn can to Rikers and all the issues that they have had there, but around the country, I have found it is abysmal how we treat people with mental illness, and we as a society are going to pay for this in the years to come.
Now, Tom, you talked about having to treat the mentally ill as patients when they come into a jail. So how does that change the calculation for how you think about intake, for how you think about dealing with employees and officers and everyone and hiring in general? Who are the people that you are seeking out who can kind of have this dual mandate?
Think about that for a second. I would challenge you to find anybody in law enforcement, whether it's a police officer or a correctional officer, who said, I'm going to become a police officer because I'm really passionate about the mentally ill. Or I want to be a correctional officer because I've always wanted to work with people with schizophrenia. Nobody. So here we have people who literally, they signed up for a profession, a job, to do a certain skill, and now they're being told, and by the way, because we really don't care in our society, you're also going to have to be a mental health professional. And so in my office, we have all of our people with CIT training, they call it, crisis intervention training. But for all my correctional staff, I have given them advanced mental health training from day one. And so they all have it now. And part of it was because that's what we walked into. Where, as Glenn referenced, I used to have about 12,000 people incarcerated in our jail on a daily basis. We've got that number down to about a little over 8,000. But on any given moment, a third of my population has got a diagnosed mental illness where they're receiving psychotropic medications. And so my staff has to be particularly aware of all these issues, because you are now taking an individual who shouldn't be there and putting them in the worst conceivable place. I often mention to people, can you imagine a psychiatrist or psychologist anywhere on the planet saying, okay, this individual has schizophrenia, I know what we should do. Let's put them in a 4x8 concrete room with a complete stranger for an indeterminate period of time. That's it. And that's what we're doing. And so my staff, we're big on training, but even so, it doesn't get around the fact that what we have here is a national disgrace going on.
I want to inject the word culture into this conversation. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was 16, I was arrested in New York City for shoplifting and sent to Rikers with $1,500 bail, because in New York City we treat 16-year-olds as adults automatically, no discretion for judges. And when I got there, I was only expected to be there for a couple of days. I was actually going back to court 48 hours later. And this was 30 years ago, and the descriptions I hear of the facilities today don't sound much different than it sounded to me 30 years ago. But I'm in a cell that's meant to hold 10 people. There's about 25 people in the cell. It was at a time when there were 22,000 people locked up at Rikers, a facility that was always only meant to hold 14,000. And a young person walked up to me and he said, "Give me your jacket." And they call Rikers Gladiator School. They still call it Gladiator School 3 decades later. And you only have two choices, predator or prey. And that's the sort of moment where you have to make that decision. And we started fighting, and a few minutes later, I emerged from that fight with 4 stab wounds, one here on my neck that was done with a pen that was melted and fashioned into a weapon. And as difficult as that was, I emerged from that fight knowing I could survive at Rikers, and I think learned a lesson that the judge was trying to teach me on that occasion. But the most difficult part was the correction officers and the way they handled that moment. They took me out of the cell. They said, we'll get you medical treatment, but one, you won't go to court today. Who doesn't want to go to court and try to get their liberty back? And two, you'll be labeled a snitch. And you won't survive at Rikers if you're labeled a snitch. And I tell this story to help you understand that delivering mental health treatment inside of a place where people are fighting to survive day in, day out, I just don't know how, no matter how much money you invest, how you can actually get that right. I mean, my older brother grew up to be a correction officer for a decade. He's now a U.S. Marshal, and I love my brother, but he is not someone I think who should be delivering mental health treatment to people in the correctional facility. He used to whoop my butt as a kid. I can't imagine him being the right person to deliver that sort of treatment. And so I say all that to say, I think we have to challenge the values that fundamentally underlie our criminal justice system to get to the finish line. I think anything else really is tinkering with a system that was built at a time where we knew less about what worked. I mean, if you look at Rikers, it was built at the height of crime in New York City when we had 2,300 murders per year there, and we didn't know what to do. We thought the answer was to hide people away on a remote island, tens of thousands of them. And now we're down to 8,000. And so now's a chance for New York City in particular to try to do something different. But what it really takes is for Americans, for New Yorkers, and for leadership to really believe fundamentally that the underpinnings of the system are just wrong, and that if you build on top of them, you're just going to get another version of what you already have.
Tom, I actually want you to respond to a little bit of that, which is the need to change the culture, not just kind of the training apparatus. How are you thinking about that? What are the things that you are telling officers and those who train officers and those who hire officers who are coming in direct contact with people who are being held?
I think some of it comes from the objective things they see around them. What I mean by that is the person I have running the entire jail is a psychologist, and I think it's the first in the history of the country to have a psychologist run a jail, especially the second largest jail. That then permeates everything down there as well. The other part of it is beyond the training part. I mean, clearly they get where I'm coming from, so they know what the boss wants. But beyond that, it's changing the different aspects of it. So most of it, it's laid out through training, but it's that we change the process of it. That we're literally, I would dare say, if you were to drop by the jail, the mental health part of it, you probably wouldn't be able to clearly discern between my jail and a hospital. And so we tried to change the different parts of it so that the two were almost one and the same. So the correctional side of it really doesn't scream out at you. Obviously, people are locked up, but if you go to some mental health hospitals, you have some similar type of environments as well. So I think by adding all those different things, it really changed the physical environment, because I know what you're talking about. I mean, it's one thing to have training and the rest of it, but how do you get people really to buy in? And I think it was by starting with this overall thing that we are, I always tell people, if they're gonna make me be a hospital, we're gonna be the best hospital. And they get it, and they understand how we're gonna treat people now, and their patients, and the amount of compassion and empathy I get out of my employees is incredible. It's blown me away, because I didn't think it was gonna hit as quick as it did, but it's been incredibly helpful. We still have, like anybody else, I have 7,000 employees. I have some bad people sprinkled in there, so we'll have bad incidents, but like you'll see in other jurisdictions, we don't have that.
I want to go back to the conversation about the ways that being jailed can exacerbate mental illness, and then exacerbate the desire or the culture of jailing the person who is now exhibiting even worse symptoms. So Glenn, I'm going to talk about some of the things that you've worked on when it comes to Rikers. I think, when we think about mental illness and the toll that it takes, when we think about jail and the toll that it takes, a lot of people kind of first became aware of this when you talk about Kalief Browder. Yep. So can you talk a little bit to that?
Sure. So, Rikers has been turning out this kind of human carnage for decades in New York City, arguably one of the most progressive, resource-rich cities in the country. And so you ask yourself, how do New Yorkers allow this place to exist in their names? And in many ways, it's like you hear about death in Syria, and you say that's horrible, and then you turn off the television and you have breakfast. In many ways, New Yorkers, because it didn't resonate with them in a way that they would end up sitting at the dinner table and having a discussion about this, we weren't seeing any traction. And then Kalief Browder happened. So Khalif Browder's story becomes the crystallization of all the horrors at Rikers. 16-year-old child gets arrested for allegedly stealing a book bag. His bail is low, I think it was $3,000. He spends 3 years on Rikers, in and out of solitary. There's all these videos showing correction officers brutalizing him, other detainees brutalizing him. He tries to commit suicide a few times. He gets out finally because the prosecutor ultimately said, you know what, we really don't have a case here. Good luck. Now, mind you, I said 3 years, right, in a country that has a constitution that allows for a speedy trial. In New York, we don't have speedy trial. We have something called a readiness rule, which prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges play around with if they have vacation or other things that they want to do to push the case forward. Because think about it, if I'm a prosecutor and someone stays on Rikers long enough, I'm going to get a plea. If I'm a defense attorney and my client stays on Rikers long enough, I can negotiate a better plea because the case is stale. If I'm a judge and I have too many people on my calendar, I can just push the case forward until 2-3 years out, hoping that some plea deal happens and we don't end up at trial. And everyone has learned how to sort of operate in that system. Anyway, Khalif Browder ultimately gets out. Jennifer Gahneman writes about his story in The New Yorker. A lot of people pay attention. They hear the unjust part of the story, and it really resonates with people. Someone pays for him to go to college, and ultimately the trauma of Rikers never went away. He never received the treatment that he needed, and he killed himself. And I got to know his mom, and she ultimately died, I would argue, from a broken heart, trying to find justice for her child. But the Khalif Browder story helped people to understand what happens at Rikers in an extremely personal way. And it inspired me to launch a campaign to actually shut Rikers down. And when I said that out loud just 14 months ago, it was a lonely place. You know, Rikers just has become an institution in New York that has a sense of permanency. And when people hear about mass incarceration, they hear about places like Rikers, it's so daunting that people sort of say, wow, that's horrible, but what can I do? And people feel paralyzed to do anything. And yet, the campaign that we built, we said to ourselves, if we build this campaign around the people who've been most harmed by Rikers, the Khalif Browders, the mothers of Khalif Browders, and we amplify those stories, then ultimately human beings hopefully will find compassion and empathy and decide that we actually do need to do something bold and different. And so I say all that to say, for me, there was no way to take Rikers and turn it into a world-class mental health treatment facility. God bless you, but you're a rarity. And so we should start from scratch. And if you start from scratch, then you have to use your imagination, right? You build smaller facilities, you make them more humane, you make them fairer, you make them cleaner, you make them brighter. You do all the things we know that attribute to positive mental health outcomes. And then finally, you have to make a decision about what sort of mental health services you build into the facility. And maybe there's a chance that you don't build it in, that you send the message that 10 years from now, we're not going to use our jails as a way to treat people with mental illness. And getting the mayor to finally come to his senses and agree that we should close down Rikers, for me, was the start of a conversation about what we do differently.
And we started with the notion of saying this is the absolute wrong place to have mentally ill folks, but our judiciary did not care. So we set up a program at the beginning where I have mental health professionals that I hired would meet people as they were being dropped off, having been arrested the night before. So they're being dropped off for their bond hearing. I hired these mental health professionals to download information from these people as they're being dropped off, give it to their public defender so that then they can take it up to the judge and say, Judge, time out. This person's mentally ill. This person is in the wrong system. They're in the wrong lane. They should be in a mental health system, not the criminal justice system. I give all that information, and I still accumulate this information. Did it for about 4 years. It's been going on 4 years. I find out about 6 months afterwards, the public defender stopped giving the information at bond court. The reason being is they found out the judges were using that against their clients because they said, if I let this guy out and I don't know about his mental illness and he does something bad, I won't get criticized. But if I know about his mental illness and I let a crazy person out, then I'm not going to be able to explain that one away. Mind you, our judges have literally lifetime tenure, so they have nothing really to fear of, but this is their mindset. And so for them, trying to set it up at the very beginning by saying, listen, they're in the wrong system, That wasn't going to work for them. And then with the judiciary, the thing that just appalled me more than anything else is when you would ask them, okay, judges, let's try to get out in front of this thing. They always came back with the same thing, Glenn, was, well, we have mental health court. That's how we're addressing it. And it didn't take me long to figure this one out. Researching this one, that was the biggest joke that we had going. I have, on average, about 3,000 people with a diagnosed mental illness in my place on a given day. They handled less than 200 cases a year. And yet the public was all being sold this thing by the judiciary that keep moving, don't pay attention here, under control, mental health courts got this thing nailed. And so these thoughtful things that people all over the country are trying to do, I can't decide, when Glenn just walked me through, because I used to be a prosecutor, when Glenn just walked through the process, that's what goes on in Cook County too. Because people, normal people, all sit there and they sort of cling to the notion that we're in America, this can't happen here, okay? And so we have speedy trial, we have right to lawyers, we have right to motions being filed, all this other stuff, so bad things can't happen. We never have speedy trials in ours. Defendants never use it. It's played out just like Glenn said. They drag it out, so do innocent people plead guilty? Oh, God, yes. God, yes. I mean, if you have your lawyer walk up to you and say, listen, you can plead guilty today and walk out, or we'll schedule a trial. It's going to be 3 to 6 months from now, and God knows what will happen. And then there's a jury tax or a trial tax that whatever the offer was, if you go to trial, they add more to it to discourage you from going to trial. Everybody knows about that. And so what happens, these cases sit and they linger, and the system is so broken. And that's why with us, we decided, okay, I can sit here and whine, and I can sit here and have more missives sent out to the judiciary and the legislators, but they don't care. And we have to acknowledge that. And so then you have to say, okay, within my own system, we'll set up our own system. And so that's why, as I said, you're so right, Glenn.
Yeah, we had a guy, there was a story in the New York Daily News recently. He served 10 years at Rikers as a detainee.
I have one sitting 10 years right now.
10 years back and forth to court. Granted, it's a serious charge, but so what? Let's get him the justice sooner, not in 10 years. I mean, the punishment is in the process, no matter what happens at the end of his case.
Right, so I want to talk about process. So you guys have just laid out the entire process for us. Doesn't sound great, doesn't sound like things are moving exactly where we want them to move. And as you said, it's a system, and you guys each play a part in the system and trying to reform the system. But at the end of the day, there are still judges, there are still officers who are bringing the mentally ill in, there are still people leveling these sentences, there are still people outside of you who are involved in this process who are, in part, jailing the mentally ill. So how do we deal with the system as a whole outside of just the mentally ill who are in Cook County Jail?
So I want to answer that. First, I'm going to answer the meaning of life. So look, culture eats policy for breakfast. Let's start there, right? Like you can try to shift policy, but shifting culture in this case is equally important, and it's going to take a long time. Like that is the most difficult part of this, is that getting people to behave differently takes leadership, takes deciding that you're going to re-incentivize the way people behave, takes measuring different things. I think human beings respond to what they're being measured by in institutions. And unfortunately, institutions tend to change people long before people change institutions. Time, again, is the rarity in my experience. Having said that, I, as an advocate, I'm always thinking about where does power live? And how do you take people who are on the margins and bring them closer in proximity to power and privilege? Because what you get out of that is you get the people who have been most harmed by the system, who have been doing more thinking about the system than anyone else, to bring their tables and their ideas to the table, their resources to the table. And the fact is, ultimately, the community is going to have to take responsibility for these folks. So you actually want the community at the table. What you also end up doing in that circumstance is you create proximity between people who have power and privilege and access, because they ultimately gain proximity to the stories of people who've been most harmed. And if you look at movement building in this country and elsewhere, it takes that sort of proximity for people to start thinking differently. If you think of HIV/AIDS, if you think of women's rights, if you think of labor movements, like it's always, things don't get to a tipping point until people hear the story, feel a connection to it, gain some empathy, and then ultimately leverage their privilege and access to say some of the same things that the most marginalized people have been saying for a really long time, to shift culture. And so if you look at New York, 14 months ago, when I said it out loud, when I spent my own capital to decide that this is the thing that my new organization was going to work on, I took a tremendous risk to do that, but not many people stood up behind me. Here we are 14, 15 months later. I cannot control the amount of elected officials that are standing up saying, I can close Rikers faster than anyone else. Why? Because we built power in the communities of the people who've been most harmed. And elected officials, as much as I'd like to think that they're leaders, they tend to look at their constituents and say, oh, look at my constituents, I'm going to go lead them. And essentially, I realized that if you can shift that, if you can shift popular culture in a different direction, that most elected officials then tend to follow and show leadership. And that's where we are in New York, and we hope to start replicating that in a number of other municipalities across the country.
I think a lot of it is just that, Glenn, is I think you start with the huge hurdle that most of the world our country, they can't believe we're doing this. I mean, honestly, they think this is just some nuanced little thing. Khalif was just an outlier case, and how can we in this country have a system that's so unjust and so horrific? And so a large part of it then is to truly educate people, because I guarantee you, thoughtful people do not want this to go on. But you have to educate them, and part of it is to gain some level of empathy. And so from like our standpoint, we do a lot of work with the media in Chicago with trying to humanize the people that we have in our custody, so that people can understand that what's going on is not right. And so in doing that, we're trying to build, similar to what Glenn was talking about, build this sort of groundswell within the culture that what's going on out there is not what you think it is. It's wrong. It's fixable. We have a template. It's working pretty good. But the big part of it, too, with that, has got to be this sense of urgency that I do not find with most elected officials. Honest to goodness. They cannot find enough issues that they can throw a task force at or a committee at on an issue that we have all the facts on already. We have them all. There aren't any question marks here. There might be some nuanced little tweaking that we can do here or there, but in the meantime, we need to get the stuff up and running. So from our perspective, it was just like Glenn said, educating, trying to get people to empathize with this, change the culture, but in the meantime, put together a model that actually works. And as my staff is very aware of, they know I'm horribly impatient. And I always say, we can't be anything but that. I mean, we have 10,000 people in our custody that, but for us, are not going to get a lot of help. And I'm churning about 200 people a day back into the community. And if we don't put something together, no one else is. And we need to help these folks, whether they're mentally ill or not. And that's one of the other fallacies, too, that people just don't understand. And as I say, that's part of the problem, that they don't understand. People confuse prisons and jails all the time. Prison you go to when you've been convicted for a defined period of time. Most all jails, including ours, you're waiting on trial. You haven't been convicted of anything. But the world we live in, I've always thought, okay, well, we put all the programs and we try to fix people as they leave prison, because everyone goes to prison. 85% of the people who enter my jail go straight from my jail to the community. And yet jails and sheriffs have been told all along, you guys don't do the program, and you're just holding them for a couple weeks, a month or so. They'll be fixed later on. And yet we're the ones that are churning people back out in the community. And so that's why with us, we put this whole community-based model together that went along with it, because you had to, because that's what we do.
Yeah, similarly at Rikers, 50% of the population turns over every 10 days.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've talked about the lack of urgency, the bureaucracy, and a seeming lack of will. Anyone who...
I'm not very popular with the other politicians in my area.
I was going to say, it seems a little...
no, they don't like me.
Seems a little lonely in Illinois for you. But all of that is coupled with the fact that if you follow politics, if you follow budgets at all, Illinois is constantly in trouble. They are constantly saying they have no money. They are constantly saying that they are cutting budgets. So
we have until midnight tonight to pass a budget, and if we don't, and it doesn't look like we will, this will be the third year in a row without a budget, and the bond industry has said they're going to reduce us to junk status tomorrow. Right. Other than that, it's all going pretty well.
Right, it's going great. And I bring this up to say that so often robust reforms, aggressive reforms, quick reforms are staunch because people say there just isn't the money to do it. Yeah. So how do we deal with this?
And that is an absolute lie. It is, because I can tell you without any hesitation, all the things we've done, and we have literally shooken the whole place up, put together this template that we've put in place. So it isn't just like on a board somewhere in my office. We're doing it. Did all this with no money. And all I did was I took positions in my office, and that's one of the benefits of having a large office, Glenn, is I took positions I didn't find to be useful. I redefined them, I put them into a different type of position and just a different theory and a different model. So it was really just taking a traditional correctional setting, which really does not have a lot of thought behind it, and putting logical threads through everything. And so, like, for example, we have this mental health treatment center that is really cool. It's a somewhat bucolic compound, not attached to the jail. It's all Quonset huts and gardens. You can't even see the fencing from the Quonset huts. It's where I house most of the mentally ill. It used to be our boot camp. I eliminated the boot camp after I studied it and found that, as in most boot camps around the country, they were the big rage in the 80s and early 90s because, we're yelling at people, making them do push-ups. No one studied them. And all of them were miserable failures. And when I looked at ours, if you were in my boot camp, you were more likely to commit an offense if you weren't in my boot camp, which to me was pretty definitive. I could stop it then. But so in the middle of the night, literally in the middle of the night one night, I took all the boot camp people out of the boot camp, put them in a different building, gave them a different mission. They now do community reconstruction. It's another program I won't get into. It's really cool though, that I invented out of whole cloth. And I put the mentally ill in that other compound. It cost me nothing. It just required thinking through, where would you put someone with a mental illness in a correctional setting? Well, get them out of the correctional setting. So that cost me nothing. The training component, it was more a little bit of moving some things around there. But I even opened up my own, because the city of Chicago has done some really ridiculous things. And one of them was they shut down half of their mental health clinics in the city with no studies, nothing. The need was greater than ever, and they shut them all down, or 6 of the 12. So I just reopened one of them a year ago. So I even run a sheriff's mental health clinic in the community where we have a lot of people leaving our jail to go back to. So all that cost me nothing. They leased it to me for $1. I take my staff that works in the morning identifying people with mental illness, and I move them in the afternoons out to the clinic, and we run the clinic. I've had vans donated to me by families of people who we treated, who were very moved by the way we treated them. They've given me vans, and so now I have vans that when people are out in the community, we can go out to the community if there's crisis to de-escalate, or we use the vans to drive them to doctor's appointments. And when people leave my compound, traditionally, it was, here's your papers, there's the door. And all my lawyers, because mind you, one of the other many great things with my job is I'm the #1 sued person in the state of Illinois. My lawyers were saying, you gotta get these guys out of here, you got a court order. Well, if someone was acutely mentally ill, I can't let them in good conscience walk out the door into the street. It's just not right. So what we've done is we've used the vans. We drive people either to hospitals or we drive them home to their families. And we have family support groups that we run to get the families re-engaged with people. So we tried to put this really thoughtful model together, and it cost us almost nothing. But that's the usual thing you mentioned, Jillian. The first time people say we got to do this, we don't have the money for it. You do. You just have to have the will to do it.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about what happens once people enter the criminal justice system, once people are actually in jails, the care they receive there. One of the things that struck me as I read about this, I have to shout out my colleague Matt Ford, who does incredible work on this issue. One of the things that really struck me were the crimes that the mentally ill commit to come into interaction with the criminal justice system in the first place. And I think the phrasing was, they are crimes of survival.
Yeah.
They are crimes to find a place to sleep. They are crimes to put clothes on your back, to eat. Occasionally they are crimes of people who clearly need medication and either cannot afford it or cannot get the help they need. Something happens, and then they wind up going through the process that you guys just described. So what needs to happen to prevent people from ever showing up in intake, or what needs to happen when it comes to the initial interactions that police officers have with the mentally ill when they've committed these crimes?
There's quite a few, and then one of the things too, and I'm sure Glenn has seen this thing, if you think about it, any society on the planet, the most impactful thing they can do to members of a society would be to execute them. Right after that would be to incarcerate them. So given the severity of that, you'd think this is wildly studied, everybody has the data, everyone. No, when I became sheriff, our whole jail system was a DOS-based computer system. And it was lucky if I can tell you who was in the place. My only point though is that when you talk about these crimes of survival, most jurisdictions really can't even tell you what people are in for because they lump them together. And so they'll say like some of the mentally ill are in on a crime of violence. I'm not trying to mitigate in any way domestic violence, but in a mental health situation, frequently a family member is trying to help their loved one, he's or she's off their meds, and then they strike them. Well, they're charged with an aggravated battery, which is a crime of violence. So Yeah, my only point is, it is even worse than we think. So there's the obvious ones and all the data showing these people are in there for retail theft or criminal trespass, trying to find a place to sleep. But even if you go beyond that and really peel into what these other charges are, you'll find that 80% of them are all crimes involving just the mental illness, having nothing to do with someone saying, I want to hurt this person, I want to steal this, I want to do all these other things. So we don't even know the universe we're talking about. But as we've peeled this apart, we have found that all of these different people that we come in contact with in that universe there are folks with a minimum amount of caseworking. You will not see them in that jail. And that's why we do caseworking now when people leave us. And we have found people who traditionally would come in 10 or 12 times a year now come either once a year or they're not coming in at all. And so the caseworking model that the medical profession nailed a long time ago, if properly funded, can work here, and we will never see these folks. And if you have the police departments properly trained with crisis intervention, instead of seeing a person who has committed an offense, legally has committed an offense, instead of arresting them, taking them to jail, they take them into custody and drive them to a hospital. So these models are being done elsewhere. We do it. Other people are starting to do a lot of this stuff too. So there are these systems out there. There just has to be this will. But when you have this big thing called the criminal justice system that the majority of the world think is working well, and they don't have any relatives in it, they don't know anybody who's been arrested, they don't care. It's not big on their list of things to do, so we don't see any change.
I agree with Tom. It's difficult to actually tell this story in a way that's hugely compelling beyond the anecdotal story because we haven't done a lot to collect data on what it is that we're doing in our criminal justice system. And it's one area of policymaking that has gotten away with making policy based on emotion and fear and you name it. And so here we are now trying to be more thoughtful about a system that clearly isn't working. I mean, when George Bush talked about this issue during the 2004 State of the Union address, I think it was a moment for the country to ask ourselves, how do we have 630,000 people exiting our criminal justice system each day? And at the same time, the overall number of the people in the system actually continues to grow. You would think that the system would shrink rapidly with that number of people exiting. And so we can't even tell the story of the intersection between homelessness, mental health, and criminal justice in most jurisdictions. When I visited Rikers Island as a result of being on a commission that was created in New York, chaired by the chief judge, called the Lippman Commission, one of the commissioners, these weren't all criminal justice folks, in fact, one of them was the president of one of our largest real estate development companies in New York, Marianne Gilmartin. And she was struck when she was walking out of a facility and saw a cork board with thumbtacks in it and asked the correction officer, what's this board all about? And she said, this is how we track where the correction officers are in the facility. A place where we're spending $240,000 per bed per year doesn't even have the technology to figure out where a correction officer is in a particular facility on any given day without using thumbtacks. And so I'm going to reiterate what I said before, which is I think that the reason I think we have to think so boldly about this is that the more boldly you think about these issues is the more what seems like high-hanging fruit becomes low-hanging fruit. What I was really struck by with our push to close down Rikers was how quickly we got them to stop putting children in solitary confinement, how quickly we got them to realize that they should take the 16 and 17-year-olds off Rikers, how quickly we got the mayor to realize that you shouldn't spend $1 billion on building another facility on an island where nothing has worked for decades. Like all the things that seemed insurmountable before suddenly became doable because the community started pushing for real reform. And on this issue of people with mental health arriving in the system, let's not forget that as great of a job as Tom is doing, ultimately he's not responsible for how these people end up in his facility, and he has little control over that, to be quite honest. I mean, our jail system has become a repository for people who fail out of all of our other policy making, whether it's economic development, community development, public health, you name it. And so the public health sector, for example, has a huge amount of responsibility to realize that they let go of responsibility for these people decades ago. And if we're really going to get to the finish line and not try to take a system that was never meant to do this and tweak it so that it does a slightly better job of it, then other disciplines have to come to the table. I mean, when I was leaving prison years ago, a correction officer said to me, you know, you being here helped me get my boat, and when your son gets here, he's going to help my son get his boat. And as difficult as it was to hear that, it was a reminder for me that if you think this is all about criminal justice and good and bad and deserving and not deserving and violent and nonviolent and victim and offender, then you're missing the point. Like, our prisons and jails serve as economic engines, that's number one, but there are so many other areas of policymaking that need to turn back and own this population as their own. Otherwise, if we're just having the conversation in the silo of criminal justice folks who care about criminal justice reform, then we are totally missing the point.
I want you to talk a little bit, Glenn kind of mentioned this. I think we're at this really difficult point when we talk about everything from policing on up to jails and prisons, where Americans, or a lot of Americans, are prone to be skeptical of supposed reform efforts. I think when you see lots of videos of police brutality, when you go back to the videos of Kalief Browder and you see how corrections officers were treating inmates, I think it's really hard for a lot of Americans to think that efforts are genuine or that they're sustainable. So I'm wondering, how can we bridge that gap between what Americans have seen and are kind of just becoming conscious to, and the real reform efforts that are trying to take place?
I think part of it is because people have not come to terms with the enormity of how bad things are and how broken they are. Because it's been so easy to push this off, and as Glenn mentioned, like with me, I can't say no to people in the sense of, they dump people at our jail, we have to take them. People have been able to conveniently sort of push that away. And then, as I say, they cling to the notion in our country things can't be this bad. And so I think you have to come to the understanding of how bad it is, because otherwise, exactly what you said, Julian, there's going to be this next case that's going to tell people reform's not going to work. This case, reform's not going to work. And so it's going to keep going on. So I think first you have to come to terms with the fact this is so horribly broken. And it is broken in a way that is hard to pinpoint for most of America, because it really is more indifference. As Glenn mentioned, are some people making money off the system? Absolutely. But by and large, it's the indifference of the different players in there. They're collecting their checks, they're getting their pensions, life is fine, we move things along, and that's how it is. There is no sense, not just of urgency, but no sense of the moral side of this thing, where people can sit there and say, are we acting in a moral fashion here? Something that we could be proud of. If we were looked at our children, we can say, this is something I'm very proud of what we're doing here. And we aren't even there yet. And so until we get there, a lot of the reforms are more superficial, and they're ones that are gonna sound good at a point, but then something bad, just like you said, is gonna occur, and it's gonna shatter everyone's belief that things are moving in the right direction. We have to come to understand, okay, the system has been broken for decades, decades and decades and decades. It permeates all these different aspects that Glenn talked about, all these other failures, and that we as a society can come up the steps of the plate and say, listen, we're going to address this, and it does not have to be outrageously expensive, but it really requires us as a society to say, listen, we've made a lot of mistakes here, and we all own this. This isn't just the people in the criminal justice system. We all probably should have known more about this. We should have investigated more. We shouldn't have just written this off that it was just happening in that community over there, and it's their issues. No, this is our country, and all these things have tentacles into things that have gone on historically for centuries around here. So that, until that occurs, I think there's going to still be a lot of, one step forward, two backward, just like you said.
So we're at the point where 100 million Americans have a criminal record on file. I think people need to hear that number to get a sense of the gravity of this issue, because I think we've done such a good job of othering people in the system, people who are locked up, that it's easy for Americans to say, well, that's that group of people. We need to figure out what to do with them, as opposed to we become a country that has moved away from things like parsimony and proportionality and citizenship and social justice and redemption and transformation, and instead ended up with a criminal justice system that's mostly about punitiveness and punishment. And it's just who we've become. It's part of our DNA. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. It's just who we are now as a country. And I remember being invited to the White House 2 years ago to meet with Valerie Jarrett and Roy Austin and other senior policy advisors to the president, only to get to the door of the White House with 50 of my colleagues and have them all walk in and have me be barred from entering the White House because of a 21-year-old conviction. And I decided to write an open letter to President Obama and have it published in the Wall Street Journal very deliberately, because here's this progressive black president saying, I care about ending mass incarceration and all the lifetime punishment that comes with it, and I can't even walk into his home on an invite. So I say that to say that punishment rarely begins for people in the criminal justice system before they get there. But when they get there, usually people are punished long before that. And it definitely doesn't abate once people leave. People are punished forever. That's just who we become. And so we have to continue to sort of challenge a system that is not giving us the outcomes we're looking for. And if you think of victims, you know, people say, well, what about the victims? That's the right question. But the most prevalent victim of violent crime in this country is young black men. And I think we're not telling a truthful story about where the victimization really lives, about our indifference to treating the trauma that comes as a result of being a victim. I remember the Manhattan DA, Cy Vance, was on a panel like this with me a couple of years ago, and 20 minutes into the conversation said, you know, hey, Glenn, you know, we've talked about reentry for the past 20 minutes. We haven't said anything about the victims. And my visceral response was, you know, DA Vance, with all due respect, I didn't learn how to pull out a gun on someone until someone pulled out a gun on me. And when I was the victim of a crime, your office wasn't interested in me as the victim of a crime. But once I became the perpetrator, you were hugely interested in me. And so how do we shift that? And then last thing I'll say is, unfortunately, the polling tells us that the better job you do of helping white Americans in particular understand that the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts people of color is the less they want to do anything about it. And so you have to create a scenario of messaging where people see themselves and see a way to be compassionate by exposing them to the stories of all types of Americans that end up in our criminal justice system. I came here from the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport with a group of high-level donors who were learning about how to invest in a way that's more socially responsible. And I was telling a similar story of my experience in the criminal justice system. And even my own bias said, you know, this audience, there's no way that they understand what I'm talking about here. And on the way back, one person in particular made it his business to sit next to me on the bus back to the hotel. Why? Because by the end of our 15-minute conversation, he talked about his daughter, who's in law school, who just got arrested 3 weeks ago for driving under the influence, and how she realized that having a lawyer standing there when she got to the judge gave her a tremendously different outcome, right? A diversion program than the 99% of people of color that were in the system with her who didn't even have a lawyer, much less a chance for an opportunity when they stood in front of that judge. So I say all that to say that, you know, the work that people like Tom is doing to try to change the system is heroic, in my opinion, but it's not what's going to get us to the finish line. It's the actual, you know, years ago, a person with HIV/AIDS would die at the steps of a hospital. Why? Because they weren't like us. And it wasn't until we got to the point where those people told their truth, decided that they were going to deal with the stigma of having the disease, but help other Americans understand how they were being treated and what it felt like, that Americans finally said, wow, that's just not how you treat sick human beings. I don't think we're there yet on this issue. I think we're far from there, but there is a roadmap on how to get there, and I think that part of it is folks like Tom being courageous and pushing back on those legislators who are being indifferent and speaking truth to power about what we need to do. I think the other part is accompanying that story with people like me who've been in the system, helping people like you understand what you can do to help change the system.
So I have another question for our panel, but before I do that, I want to let you know that we're saving a few minutes at the end for questions. I've had a chance to ask our panel lots of different things, but if you guys have questions, start thinking about them, keep them short, succinct, and questions versus comments, please. And we will get back to you in 1 second. So we've talked about prevention, we've talked about what happens in the system. Glenn, you mentioned this a little bit. I want to talk about how we deal with reentry and how inadequate reentry is, not just for people who have been incarcerated, but especially for people who have been incarcerated and are suffering from mental illness. What are the things that we are not doing there, and what are the things that we could be doing immediately?
We started signing people up for the Affordable Care Act 3 or 4, I lose track of time now, 3 or 4 years ago, and so we've signed up, I think, 25 or 30,000 people have insurance now, and we do it at intake. And that's huge because, so we case manage these folks with their illnesses. We work them right up to the door. We even try to get them to, we work out rides, we work out all that. Then we do discharge planning for all of the people there. And so just like a hospital, we give them a list of things to do when they leave. We give them a map of their area where all their pharmacies are at, all the mental health treatment places that they can access, and then they have insurance cards. And so we do that with a hotline number back to us if they run into problems. And so for them, we have that aspect of it. We do job training as well, and we also have job fairs out there. Our bigger issue is, frankly, with the non-mentally ill, trying to work on the job component, because I can't tell you, Glenn just referenced it. I mean, the public is so naive to this thing. It is unreal how naive they are. They think, once again, we read it in a book, this person got sentenced to 2 years of probation and they served their probation, that's the end of it. No, they carry it around forever, A, but B, we have all these collateral consequences. So in some states, you can't vote anymore. Many states, you aren't allowed into public housing anymore, so now you have no place to live, and many places won't hire you anymore because you have a criminal conviction as well. So I've often said to people, I go, why don't we just at least be honest for a second? Say, listen, we're gonna give you 2 years probation, but we're gonna make it so that you have no place to live, and as another part of the sentence, because we particularly don't like you, we're gonna make sure you can't get a job. And so with us, we attempt to try to work through all of those collateral consequences that are out there that are very, very tricky. And so right now, our focus has been, as they say, with the mentally ill, we treat them like a patient leaving a hospital. With a job component we work on, but that's very tricky, but we've been working on that. But for the non-mentally ill, it's coming up with scalable job opportunities. Because I talk with the detainees all the time. And one guy, I'll never forget, when I first got there as sheriff, I asked him, he said, how are we treating you? Because I was just conditions-wise. And he said, oh, this is the best I've ever been treated. And I said, well, that's depressing to hear you've been here before. He goes, yeah. He goes, but I'm getting out. I can't wait to get out. I got my kids, and I said, great. I go, what are you going to tell me is going to lead me to believe you aren't going to be coming back? And he sat and thought for about 10 or 15 seconds. And then he said, Tom, I'm probably coming back. And I go, why is that? I go, you said you don't want to be here. And he said, well, I didn't have a felony conviction when I got in here. I couldn't get a job. Now I'm going to have a felony conviction. I probably won't be able to get a job. And he wasn't whining or complaining, but he said, I probably can't get a job. I can always get a job dealing dope. They're always looking for someone to stand on a street corner. And you guys will probably end up catching me, and I'll be back in here. And I remember after talking to him, it was like there was nothing he said that was not logical there. I mean, he needs to have money to survive. He's not Hannibal Lecter out there trying to hurt people. He was just a human being, no different than us, who had limited opportunities, most of it foisted by us. And so those are the challenges when Glenn's talking about it. The enormity of the problem is incredible here. And so a discharge plan for everybody that includes job components and housing, they're doable. They're tricky. We're doing elements of it. We have a wild cooking program we got going on right now too that is really cool, because I've met with the Restaurant Association and they said they'll hire my people if I give them a certificate that's an 8-hour class that I do while they're with me, and it's scalable. So we have all these different programs going on, but we need just more engagement from the public.
So when I came home from prison 15 years ago, I had earned a 2-year quality liberal arts degree while I was in prison. So obviously much better situated than most people leaving prison, wasn't unstably housed, didn't have a mental health issue, no history of addiction, much more better position than most people leaving prison. I did have almost $100,000 in fine, fees, and restitution to pay back. And we haven't talked much about the financial consequences of being involved in the criminal justice system, which is moving people from the prison to debtor's prison, arguably. I visited 50 different employers or so in about 30 days. These were entry-level jobs, trying to move boxes from here to here. And the majority of those employers turned me down based solely on the criminal record. Most of them I couldn't get through the door. 2 years later, I was running a nonprofit with a $23 million budget with 212 people reporting to me. So it wasn't about qualifications, it was about that criminal record. And those employees, I would argue, paid a price for that. I mean, the fact of the matter is that unfortunately, because employers are citizens, human beings, just like anyone else, and you get your criminal justice information from the news, and if it bleeds, it leads. The fact of the matter is that all you hear about is the worst of the worst, and I can't think of anyone who has the least amount of appetite for risk than employers. And if they think that there's any true liability risk there, they respond to it by not even hiring people with criminal records. Something quickly about reentry. I also served as the Associate Vice President of one of the largest reentry programs in the country during my career since getting out of prison. And so I had a chance to see what reentry looks like up close. New York City has the most robust infrastructure of reentry social service programs of anywhere in the country. And at the same time, to run a multi-million-dollar reentry program, you have to rely heavily on government dollars to keep the program up and running, to make it sustainable, to plan from year to year. And so the government asks you to do $1's worth of work and gives you a nickel to do it with and asks you to do it in 6 months. Like, everything about it is unrealistic. And so you end up building programs around that reality. And so you end up having an employment program where the funder, whether it's government or even some private institution, says, you need to have contiguous employment of this person for a year for us to pay you the $5,000 or $6,000 that we'll give you for training this person and placing them. The problem is that contiguous employment is actually defined as the person can lose the job 4 times during the year for 45 days in between, and as long as you get them reemployed, we'll pay you for the entire year. Like, what does that do for that individual? I can get just about anyone a job for a month and a half, 2 months, before they blow the opportunity and I get them another job. And also, what type of jobs am I placing them in? High turnover, low benefits, no fringe, the same type of stuff that's going to put them right back on the cycle of incarceration and homelessness and addiction and so on. So, I'd like to think that over the last decade and a half, since we've engaged in what's called the Second Chance Act, that things have changed around reentry offerings. But I'm not hopeful on that end, to be honest. I'm more hopeful about the fact that the culture has shifted as a result of people trying way downstream to help people who are exiting prison and becoming frustrated by those efforts not being successful and realizing that we got to go much further upstream to figure out how we got here.
Did we have any audience questions?
One or two.
I think we have time for 1 or 2. Let's start right over here. Yep.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you so much. Just a quick history lesson for me and maybe people in the room. The decision years ago, decades ago, to close the state psychiatric hospitals across the country, how has that, they weren't operating correctly and functioning properly, but how has that decision changed and created the jails we have today?
It is actually, you can't have one without the other. Your questions are on target. It was devastating, but people, because it happened so long ago in the 50s and early 60s, people aren't making the connections. But forever in my world, 50s and 60s, when they shut them down, the second part of the formula, and John Kennedy was the one who drove it, was we're going to have this real robust community programs that out there, get people out of these horrible hospitals and put them out there. Well, he was assassinated, Vietnam occurred, they never did the community program at all. And so people were sort of left literally on the streets, and it was left for states to sort of figure it out. Some states got more engaged than others didn't. In the course of the last 10 years, it was never really well funded. The last 10 years, the funding has plummeted all around the country for mental health. And people always ask, how is it the case? And I can tell you from my tortured 11-year sentence as a legislator, mine was in our legislative body, that the mental health funding was always at the back end. Why? Because the stigma surrounding mental illness, people don't want to say that my brother or my husband has this illness. So when it came to lobby legislators and say, don't cut this, there was these great advocates, but there was a handful of them. They didn't get all the calls they'd get if they were trying to cut education funding and things like that. And so mental health funding has always been at the front line as far as eviscerating. And so you have these amazing advocates who are trying to piece this together, but now, particularly in our state, there's nothing left. And so I'm running one of the bigger clinics, I'm running the stuff, and my God, I was not supposed to do it. So what you talked about, that started the ball rolling, and it's been devastating.
And I think we're going to try and squeeze in maybe 2 more questions, one over there and then right here.
I thought I didn't have a chance. This was an excellent discussion, and I thank an experienced and knowledgeable panel.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Question: what would be the specific suggestions to get the cultural change that is needed to treat defendants in the criminal justice system who are mentally ill, recognize, one, they have a disease, and two, if you have a disease and mental illness, more often than not, you can give effective treatment. That would help. And three, to know if public safety is not an issue, that you could really think about going outside the walls and have diversion programs like we're now doing with drug cases. How can you do this? How can you make specific changes other than the wonderful suggestions you are doing? I asked that as a judge in the Circuit Court for Baltimore City since 1986, in a city which has one of the highest homicide rates in the country, which is known as the heroin capital of the United States, where 95 of our defendants are African American and poor, but has successfully implemented with felony drug cases the past year a pilot genuine diversion program outside the walls.
Thank you.
So what I've learned about the system is that oppressive systems are durable and reinvent themselves right under your nose while you're trying to reform them. And I have found that, for instance, I've worked for an organization that did diversion for hundreds of people, mostly based on addiction issues. Sometimes we'd be able to squeeze in cases around people who don't have employment or are homeless and so on. I don't think we're there yet on the mental health issue because of the double stigma of the criminal record and having a mental health issue, and that communities of color have an additional layer of stigma attached to the idea of getting treatment for a mental health issue. But what I did learn in the time that I worked, particularly in the reentry and alternative to incarceration space, is that you can chop away at the system and be bolder and bolder and shift culture. It takes time. For instance, at first in New York, all you could get diverted was a misdemeanor, and then ultimately nonviolent drug offenses, and then nonviolent offenses. And now we have programs like Common Justice that actually allow for the diversion of people charged with serious violent offenses, actually with the blessing of the prosecutor in New York. And yet, on this particular issue, I think we're not there yet, and I think we're not there yet because people, like prosecutors, do what they think is palatable to the public, and the public is not yet there on this issue. I think that people who speak with authority about how we can do a better job of treating people with mental health illness outside of the system need to have more of a voice on this particular issue. I think they will be seen as the authority. I think they will help mitigate the conversation about public safety. You know, when I hear public safety, I'm just struck because we could probably do nothing and have better outcomes than what we currently have around public safety, to be honest. Like, we have abysmal outcomes in terms of public safety. When you ask victims what they want, they say, I want the person to never do it again. We have a system that does quite the opposite.
You know, Glenn, my staff always get a kick out of it because I always talk, when I talk about this issue, I say, hey guys, the beauty of, because we always are trying these new things and with no like big plan here, but let's just give it a try. And I say, the beauty of it is the criminal justice system. How could we conceivably screw it up any more than it is? And it's somewhat the truth. I mean, it has got no logical threads to it. It's not got these performances. And that's what you're talking about, Judge. The big thing that's so important with these different programs is you have to have metrics attached to them. Because so many of these programs that are usually the ones that are used when people are trying to eviscerate programs to say this was a waste of money, so many of these programs are people who are very well-meaning, who are very passionate about it, but yet they don't have metrics attached to it. And then they get the anecdotal horror story that occurs in the program, and then they kill the program off. Right. And some of them, I think, fear the metrics because they're worried that what they believe so much in isn't going to work, so they'd rather not do it. But all of our programs we've attached it to. We found some programs didn't work. We eliminated them. I took the money and used it on other programs that have better success rates potentially. But that's really important. And then to have, you know, the leadership, because it's what Glenn said. The politicians, you know, as a class are very cowardly. I mean, I think we all know that. And so as a result of that, you have to be very direct with them, and you have to not let them off the hook, is what it is.
Do we have time for one more very quick question? I think I promised you. Sorry,
I was
promise.
rooting for you, actually.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I'll make my question really quick. Solitary confinement and the mentally ill. So I don't know about the U.S., but a bill has been tabled in Canada to limit time in solitary confinement to 15 days. This is after a number of high-profile suicides, unfortunately. Can you talk about the role of isolation in U.S. prisons as it relates to the mentally ill? And overall, is there a time limit for solitary confinement?
There isn't. The kicker is that we just eliminated ours about a year and a half ago. And when I say that, I can't tell you, and last I checked, I'm the boss, what a struggle it was, because I'd say we are not going to have solitary confinement. So for about a year, I'm operating under the understanding we have no version of it. Then I stumbled across the fact that we have administrative segregation. And I was like, okay, walk me through what that is, guys. And it says, well, that's when we have to set someone in by themselves for an extended period. And I go, how is that different from solitary? Good question, boss. Yeah. So after a struggle that took literally about a year and a half, we've been operating with no segregation of any nature now for about a year and a half. I think we're the only ones in the country doing it. And the reason I tell you that is because you can't get a straight answer from people. I mean, you go to somebody and ask them, okay, do you have solitary? They say, well, oh, absolutely not. They'll have disciplinary segregation. They'll have administrative segregation. It's the exact same thing, but they'll tell you no, and they'll believe it. And then good luck. I'll tell you what, one of the things that really gets me going is that I've worked with the Department of Justice for years now. We've had a really positive relationship, and we had a consent decree that's been around for 40 years. We just got out of it 2 weeks ago, I think it was. And that all great working with them, but boy, oh boy, talk about people who really have no right to be casting aspersions at local governments and that. When I went to the Department of Justice to ask, and I couldn't have been more sincere and say, listen, I want to get my arms around, are we good, bad, in the middle as far as use of force on detainees? So I sent out to the Bureau of Prisons. I figured a phone call would do. We're in the law enforcement world together. Can you tell me what your stats are the last 5 years? Are your use of forces up, down, sideways, how many a year? Refused to give it to me, said it can only come about by freedom of information, and that will take 9 months. It took 14 months. I just got it back 2 days ago. They apparently, in 3 of their federally run runs, in Chicago, LA, and I think I'll say, have no use of forces, which is absolutely inconceivable. It can't be. And then they gave me like 2 pages of redacted information and then like 20 pages of computer printouts that is just gibberish. That's what I waited for to get from them. And so when you try to find out what's going on in these institutions, good luck. And it was one of the things when I first became sheriff, I was like, you know what, we are going to open this place up because you know what, it's a tough job, it's got a lot of things that can go bad, but as long as it's shrouded in this horrific secrecy, the public will rightfully think the worst. Let's open this thing up and show all the warts with it. Well, we're somewhat unique in doing that. So a long way to answer your very short question, I couldn't think of anything worse for someone mentally ill to put him in solitary confinement. And here's the other part of that, what I was referencing earlier, because people don't have their arms around it, they think jail, then they're off to prison. When I'm spewing 85% of my population right back to the street, but people are being put in solitary confinement, leaving solitary confinement and going directly to the street, what do you think is going to happen? I can tell you what's going to happen. And so we started running these numbers, the historic ones, because we've stopped it. But what had happened before, and when people were in like disciplinary segregation, we found like 45% of the people that were in some variation of segregation were going straight from the jail to the community. How could you conceivably set that community up worse, that person up worse, than to do that? And yet it is absolutely going on all around the country right now, and good luck finding it out.
Oh, all right. We do have to stop there. You guys have other panels to go to. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.